There are a handful of European countries that you would think have insanely high taxes, and for most people they do. But for foreigners who move there, you can cut your tax rate to as low as the single digits. Today I'm going to share with you this ancient tax hack that can save you millions. One of the lessons that I'm trying to tell people is headline tax rates don't necessarily matter. People are going to a place like Dubai, for example, because they see, oh, it's tax-free. If I want to move out of my country and go to a new one and pay much less in tax, I should go to a place like Dubai. And they're overlooking not only the fact that depending on where their income comes from, they may actually be paying more tax in a place like the UAE than they would in some of the countries we're going to talk about today. They're overlooking territorial tax countries and tax-exempt countries, all because they say, oh, that country in Europe has high tax rates. But if the high tax rates don't apply to you, then it doesn't really matter. Today, I'm going to talk about 4 countries that you can take advantage of this. And very simply, they are all right here in Europe. The UK, where the program started, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus. These programs are in countries that all speak English. They are countries formerly connected with the British Empire. And the program we're talking about today is what's called the non-dom program. This is for folks who are able to be non-domiciled for tax purposes in one of these countries. And so in most cases, if you've just grown up in Ireland, for example, and you go out and get a job, you're going to pay rather high income tax rates on that income. 20% of the first 40,000 euros or so, and 40% plus some additional surcharges above that. And so someone might look at a country like Ireland or the UK and say, oh, their taxes are insane. But if you're able to move there as a foreigner and you can prove this non-dom status, i.e. it's not your permanent home, it's not where you plan to die, your parents, especially your father, weren't from there. This is a simplified version, but you can be able to file a non-dom tax return and only pay tax based on the money you remit. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of specific examples of this a little bit later in this episode because each of the programs are a little bit different. The UK's program is the most strict, which perhaps doesn't matter because unless you happen to have British or Irish citizenship, if you're an entrepreneur or investor, the avenues for relocating to the UK these days are relatively slim. But Ireland, Malta, Cyprus all have various immigration programs where you can move there and you can combine that with this non-dom tax status to not only be able to work towards a citizenship in a Tier A citizenship country in the European Union. If you become Irish, you'd then later be able to live in the UK because Irish citizens have that privilege through what's called the Common Travel Agreement. But you can basically have access to these top-tier countries if you don't want to move to Dubai, if you don't want to move to some of the tax-friendly countries that we've talked about, whether it's Georgia or Panama or Malaysia. This is one system that many people overlook. So here's how it works. And by the way, for people who are trying to convince their spouse to move overseas, these countries may be a lot of it easier to convince your spouse. The origins lie in British imperial history. The role of domicile was introduced with the first levying of income tax back in 1799, which was introduced to fund the Napoleonic Wars. British residents were exempt from paying income tax on their foreign income unless it was remitted to Britain. When income tax was introduced on a major and permanent basis by Lloyd George in 1906, he explicitly brought out what they call this imperial basis. The citizen of the empire who was not domiciled in this country was exempt from income tax on their overseas income. Now, these provisions were curtailed for a lot of UK residents later during the 20th century, but they were never abolished. And so basically, the system is money that you bring into these countries while you are a non-dom is taxed. Again, I'm giving you a layman's introductory version. So let's look at how that works. One thing I like about these programs is they're more flexible than, for example, Portugal's NHR program that a lot of people talk about. Portugal's NHR program restricts where you can have your business. So let's say you leave your country, you want to set up your company in Hong Kong or the UAE or the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, just keep the business tax-free. Maybe you're willing to pay some tax on the personal side for where you live on a lifestyle basis. You can't really do that in a place like Portugal. So you can come and you can have your company. Let's just say we're putting the company in a UAE free zone, and let's say that our business makes $5 million a year. Now, that's going to be zero tax in the UAE if you run it according to the new free zone rules with the UAE's new corporate tax on onshore companies. Let's say you want to live in Ireland. And so Ireland is going to say, hey, number one, if you are not an EU citizen, you need to have a way to be in the country. That may involve having a salary. So let's say you have a 100,000 euro salary, and you're going to pay probably something like 35% of the time you're done with that. So you're paying 35,000 euros to get your foot in the door. Now, if you already have an EU passport, or if you're a British citizen, you could just come and register in Ireland the same way you always would. Also, there are ways that if you do this for a couple of years, depending on the salary, you could get a higher level visa that doesn't require you to actually work. Here's what happens in European countries. You have to make tax and immigration work. I've gone through this myself, and I've seen just why a service like what Nomad Capitalist offers is so important, because you'll talk to different lawyers, different accountants, and they'll give you great plans that don't work it all together. We are the architect, and we're the general contractor of low tax plans or tax-free plans that also help you get banking, citizenship, all the accoutrements of being a nomad capitalist. But you have to have the plans work together. And so one of the big issues that you'll come into in Europe is, if you're living there and if you're running your business from there, you don't want your UAE business to be sucked into the other tax system. You might want to, have an entity that pays some tax in that country based on the output. So let's say, I'm going to be in Ireland. I'm one of 60 people in Nomad Capitalist. Maybe I've had a couple other employees, so now maybe we're 3 out of 60 or 4 or 5 out of 60. Depending on what those people do, maybe 10% of the value is here in Ireland. So you may need to do some tax planning on, what value needs to be a source to Ireland. But generally speaking, you can keep most of this $5 million in the UAE. But here's where it's interesting. How much does it cost for you to live in a country like Ireland? And so you could say, all right, I make $5 million, but the less I spend, the less tax I'm going to pay. I need $250,000 to live a nice life. Now, rent in a city like Dublin is very expensive. If you don't want to live in Dublin, you'll pay a lot less. If you want to buy a property, that's going to take a lot of money. I'll come back to that in a moment. $250,000. Now, you're going to get whacked on that as additional income. You're already making $100,000, so this is all going to be at the higher band. You're going to probably be left over with about $125,000. So if you actually want $250,000, now you've got to bring in $500,000. But we're making $5 million, so we can see the distance between what you're earning and what you're spending. I mean, the further it is, the lower your tax rate is, because let's say it's $500,000 and you keep about $250,000. So $250,000 out of $5 million, that's 5%. Plus this, it's essentially it's the same as 5%. Now, if you want to live at large, if you're like, I need $1 million to live, well, then you're over here, and then you're putting a larger pool of that money that needs to be taxed at full income tax rates. One thing some of these non-dom countries allow you to do is have what's called tax-free capital. It's kind of our colloquial term here for it at Nomad Capitalist. You might say, hey, listen, I've already accumulated, $5 million in dividends. By the way, the sooner you get to this UAE company, the sooner you get to being offshore, the faster you're going to be accumulating income. Hard to accumulate this when you're living in your country paying 40% tax. Let's say you got $5 million, and that's done the year before. It's sitting there. It's done the year before you move to a non-dom country. You can often, and not tax advice here, bring that money in first. So let's say you want to buy a house that costs $3 million. You can bring that money in. That money was made before you came in. Therefore, that's exempt. And then you could use the rest to live for a while. I'm a fan, quite frankly, in these systems. I don't mind paying some tax, because what I'm getting is higher quality countries to live in the opinion of many people. I happen to love countries like Malaysia. I like popping into Colombia. I like popping into Serbia. But if you want to live a developed life, I'll tell you, UK and Ireland, you've got full Amazon. In a country like Ireland, for example, you're part of the EU. You can order stuff. I mean, the consumer conveniences of ordering stuff online. You're not going to have the challenges or the customs hassles that you have a lot of other places. So that's what I said when, hey, we see some people who their spouses aren't so sure they want to move. They hear us talking about Serbia. No way. Okay, why don't you move to the heart of Europe? You are 5 or 6 hour flight to the United States in a place like the UK or Ireland. If you want something warmer, we come out here to Malta and Cyprus. And before we get to Malta and Cyprus, let me just tell you this. The whole system of how this works is, I'm not planning to live in this country forever. I have a home. Let's say I'm from the United States. My parents are from the United States. Hey, I plan on going to the United States. That's where I plan to die. I'm just living here for a while. That's why I get the status. Over time, you could develop what's called a domicile of choice in some of these countries. And so the longer you live there, the more connections you make. In some cases, if you get citizenship, which down in Malta and Cyprus, by the way, you'll be told you can get it in only a few years, especially in Malta. It doesn't really work that way. When they say 5 years, we've been told by our attorneys, For naturalization, really 18 years. And especially down in the Mediterranean, that could knock out your non-dom status. Hey, you're a citizen. That's a step too far to say that you aren't domiciled here. And yet in Ireland or the UK, I mean, in the UK, the Labour Party says this system's unfair because you've got politicians at the highest level of power. I mean, the Prime Minister's wife, I believe, was non-dom for some time and just eventually said, hey, okay, fine, I won't do it because there's just too much PR here. But theoretically, you could even become a citizen and keep this deal as long as you meet the conditions of being non-dom. Now, let's talk about Malta and Cyprus. These are a bit more friendly. Malta has very special rates on capital gains. Malta has a system. They've got a bunch of different programs down here. You might have heard they have the citizenship program where you can get Maltese citizenship in a matter of about 18 months. That's good if you just want to move to Ireland. You don't want to get a residence permit in Ireland. Maltese citizens can move to Ireland. They can move to Cyprus. But Malta, Cyprus, and Ireland all have ways to get in there. Malta has numerous residence programs. And then what you're doing is you're pairing an immigration program with a tax plan. You don't have to do both. You could just say, hey, I want to immigrate there. And especially in Malta and Cyprus, the immigration plans don't really require you to be there. So you wouldn't have a tax plan for a country that you're not going to be in. If you just come to Cyprus and spend a week or two a year at your villa that you buy through their real estate, residence program, you don't need a tax plan. Cyprus doesn't consider you tax resident. Now, if you're a world traveler, Cyprus is one that could be potentially interesting. If you're willing to spend a couple months a year there, that could be a tax residence you can use as you travel to different countries. But let's talk about some of the differences here. Again, the UK has some of the most complicated rules. Fine, no big deal. Probably not going to work for most people watching this. In Cyprus, non-doms are exempt from taxation on interest and dividends for almost 2 decades of residence. And so unlike the UK, where it's a remittance basis, in Cyprus, this is the case even if the income is a Cyprus source or it's remitted to Cyprus. And so in Ireland, things like capital gains actually have lower rates. And so what you can do with this system, we go back to our numbers, is depending on what kind of income you bring in, there is a bit more work in terms of tracking, for example, what is a remittance. So theoretically, I mean, there could be a debate on some things, but if you have a credit card and you're buying stuff, that's a remittance. And so for someone like myself who's traveling to different places, the equation that makes this a bit more favorable is, let's say you spend 6 months in one of these countries. You spend 6 months, you're a tax resident. However, let's say you want to spend the other 6 months, spend it at your winter home in Malaysia, spend it, traveling the world, spend it, doing business travel. The money that you're sending to those countries, as long as you keep things segregated, doesn't necessarily have to be an issue. So now this $500,000, that's what you need to live for, whether it's 6 months, whatever. Now, if you're going to live in these countries and you want citizenship, you're going to have to be there the vast majority of the year, generally speaking. So the citizenship does require substantial time on the ground. However, getting to a more substantial version of residence does not necessarily. And so this is something that I think a lot of people misunderstand, where they say, I'm going to live in my country, let's say it's the US, and I'm going to have a company in the British Virgin Islands, and I'm going to have my customers pay that company, and as long as I don't bring the money to the US, I don't pay tax. That's wrong. The US and most other Western countries have control and foreign corporation rules. They have permanent establishment rules. There's many different ways that you're the owner, you're the guy running the business, what have you, you're going to pay. So just sitting in the US, sitting in Canada, putting your corporation somewhere else doesn't really do anything. You don't just move your assets, you move your you move your tuchus somewhere else. These countries, you could be tax resident, but under favorable circumstances, because the idea now is, hey, listen, people may not come and live in our country if they've got to pay the same rates that our people charge. And we're not going to become a tax-free jurisdiction, but let's give them a deal saying, hey, what you bring in here, and of course what you make from here, let's say if you start buying rental properties in Ireland or you buy Irish stocks or whatever else, hey, we'll tax you on that because that's what we're doing. But if you're making $5 million over here and only 500,000 of it's here, you're going to pay our full rates. But the bigger this disparity is, the lower the overall tax rate. And so if you can get this down to the single digits, this works for me as a more frugal person who's pretty conservative. If you're a baller and you're making $5 million in Dubai and you're spending, you're going out and buying bottles and you're doing everything, this isn't going to work as well for you. But remittance is an issue that's often confused. Non-dom is where remittance really matters. Doesn't matter if you're just, putting your corporation somewhere and you live in a residential, tax jurisdiction where they tax everything that you earn worldwide. Canada, UK, Australia, if you're just living there, they tax everything worldwide, including your offshore companies. You have to leave the country to get out of that deal. And you have to find a country to go to. These non-dom countries can be one of these. These are the 4 countries, really, where money that just comes in, that's the basis for what gets taxed. Now, Thailand, we've talked about, they have what's called a territorial tax system. So foreign income, again, your UAE company would be, in many cases, foreign income. It's worth evaluating, by the way, if you're doing work for the company, how that works in Thailand. We do that for our clients. But Thailand is a rule where it's not deemed foreign income if you bring it into that year. So there's certain ways to handle that. It's not really a non-dom program. It's just a territorial program with a remittance element to it. But this historical kind of British idea of domicile means the money you bring in is taxed. And so that's credit cards. That's everything that you bring into the country, basically, minus what that initial capital you set aside. They each operate a little bit differently. So understand, again, UK, the most difficult. UK and Ireland, not really that friendly to cryptocurrency because, yes, I mean, in some cases you'll put cryptocurrency in a corporate structure. Even that's kind of like, it's hard. Like, I mean, if it's an exchange and exchange accounts in a corporate, I mean, maybe. But generally speaking, the UK and the belief is Ireland have this idea, not entirely codified, that you're just holding crypto. That means it's here. But for businesses, for investments, there are some exceptions in a country like Ireland. So like certain kinds of ETFs would be exempt and you have to pay a certain rate. So there's little things you've got to pay attention to. That's how it works in Europe. It's not just a plain, simple, don't pay us, leave us alone. Malta and Cyprus, probably in the easier side. The question is, do you want to live in the Mediterranean? They're also on the warmer side, of course, rather than up here on the rainier side. But, less to do, a little bit less developed. I mean, beautiful places. So less friendly up here to crypto in the UK and Ireland. A little bit more stringent rules, a little bit higher rates. Down in the Mediterranean, Malta and Cyprus, less likely to get citizenship, whereas, a little bit easier up here if you put in the time. But, more flexibility. So this is a general summary. Do not take this as applying to every situation. There are different, things that go on in every person's situation. All the 4 countries are different. This is a basis. Now, other countries in Europe you might have heard about which have kind of similar programs, but it's based on just paying a lump sum. Switzerland, Greece, Italy, also quasi-similar programs in places like Gibraltar and Jersey, very small. We'll put them up on the screen. Those have, hey, you pay us a certain amount of money, and as long as you follow some rules, that's all you have to pay us. And so that's what's called a lump sum. In Switzerland, it's a bit more complicated because every canton, they kind of work out how much you owe. Places like Italy, it's 100,000 or 125 if you marry. Lump sum means you pay and we leave you alone. The remittance gives you a bit more flexibility in that, hey, if business is down 1 year, now if business is down in Italy, you could just elect to be taxed as anybody else, and then you don't get that tax deal back. In the non-dom countries, you get to have a bit more control over how much money you're bringing in, when you're bringing it, for what you're bringing in, how much time you spend in the country. So you could debate, do you want to spend, 100,000 euros? Let's change that to a euro symbol. So whatever that is, $110,000 at the given moment. Anywhere in Europe, they're converting whatever currency you set it into euros. And there's even some little peculiarities on, when was the currency exchange? Did you get a profit on that? But, 100,000 euros in Italy, live there 1 day, live there 360. If you're living there 1 day, why would you do that? You've got to figure out which one works better for you. So non-dom lump sum, 2 programs in Europe that give you access to live there. You're not going to pay nothing. You might pay 50 grand, 100 grand. If in Switzerland, could be hundreds of thousands. By the way, if you're going to Switzerland, the same way that it's easier to move to these countries with the European passport through citizenship by descent or through Malta's program, you actually get a better deal in Switzerland if you're an EU citizen. So that's where Malta's program can pay off for some people. Malta has a $1 million, give or take, citizenship program. We help people figure this out. So I see far too many people just saying, I want to go to Dubai. That's the be-all and the end-all. And then sometimes we see in the New York Times, it wasn't for me, I go home. I think a country like in Ireland is a lot more friendly. I mean, if you live in somewhere in New England or New York, maybe the Midwest, that's probably a lot less of an adjustment, certainly linguistically and probably culturally, than moving to a lot of other tax-friendly places. Maybe the price of continuing to live a nice life, being able to get a second citizenship, paying not zero, but some lower amount of taxes, is worth just saying, hey, listen, I'll pay 100 grand. It's better than paying, on this, you're going to pay $2 million in a lot of Western countries. You can move somewhere, you can pay 100 grand. Obviously, for Americans, the U.S. continues to be the picture. But the bottom line is this. If you would like to legally reduce your taxes and you want someone to put all the puzzle pieces together for you, in these countries, it is not just a simple setup. You need different vendors, different lawyers, different experts. I am not a lawyer. I am not a CPA. But we have an entire network of hundreds of folks that we have worked with for, in some cases, many years. They've been vetted, they're trusted, and we serve as the general contractor. If you're moving to Europe, especially, if you're moving anywhere, really, you want a general contractor to manage a trusted group of people. You can go to nomadcapitalist.com. We start by first architecting your plan. Where do you want to go? What are the elements that are involved? We build the whole plan out, and then we execute it and serve as the general contractor for all the experts, because even in one country, the immigration and tax specialists may not be on the same page. Someone needs to unify them, let alone where your banking is, where your employees are, where you're coming from. Go to nomadcapitalist.com and learn how we can help you.